Avoid legal snags by telling people they're being recorded. You're being recorded, and you're a lawyer. So we good? Okay.
We're good.
All right. I don't know if it's gonna work. It will really. I don't know if you know how pissed off I get when these things don't record, but I get pretty pissed off. All
I
right.
kind of imagine.
All right. You ready? Here we go.
You want me to do the welcome?
Come on, man.
I'm just kidding. I don't have it.
You can close. You can close.
I always sound like a freaking idiot when I do like the opening. I'm like, oh, welcome to everybody here on the podcast.
Which is fine. Like, it's I've always said like I'm never gonna do a radio voice when I do this, and then I do a radio voice. So it is what it is. We could just start, but no. All right, here we go. Can you cut me some of those? Cut like 2 of them, babe. Did you peel it? It's okay, you don't have to. All right. Sorry. We went for the necessities today. I haven't been out of the house in a week, and I went and bought cucumbers and hummus.
Nice.
Ooh, nice. Did you rinse it? Okay.
Maggie, you want to do the read for us at the start of the podcast?
Maggie, do you want to start the pod?
No.
Oh. Jeez.
Probably shouldn't have eaten the cucumber. Okay, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to another edition of Everyone Hates Cleveland. This is Jim Pete, joined by the original kind of, I guess for a while, it was just Mike and I. I think it was. But I'm here today with Mike Hattery. Gage Will is on this call, but, you know, he's bouncing on a trampoline or, I don't know, whatever he's doing. Before we get into this podcast, though, just a quick kind of throw out there to everybody who's dealing with COVID-19 and the coronavirus. We are not going to be talking about that in this podcast just because it's on every piece of media that you can turn on to. But we do want to acknowledge the fact that everybody is dealing with a really odd situation. And we hope everybody out there that's listening is okay. And part of the reasons why we're doing the podcast is to give you something to do while you're sitting at home looking for something to do. Mike, what's up?
How much? I like that. That's a nice open. Give to your local food bank.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Fine. Lots of people out there are desperately in need. Buy local, help somebody out, like have them mow your lawn, do something, figure out a way to help. I digress. And now it feels kind of silly talking about the Cleveland Indians.
Let's do it, man. Let's talk Cleveland baseball.
This is I think the third straight podcast that we've done, 2 of which have just disappeared into the ether. But Mike, I want to jump into this conversation today. We don't know what we have to talk about. We usually would be doing positional previews. We'd be dead set in the middle of a season right now if everything was even. But of course, now we don't know if there's going to be a season. And for those of you who haven't been to everyonehatescleveland.com in a while, Mike posted a piece yesterday how a canceled 2020 season could impact the Indians over the next few years. And Mike, let's start with the low-hanging fruit. I mean, probably the biggest conversation over the offseason was how, like, the asset of Francisco Lindor was going to impact the Indians going forward, whether as someone you trade or someone you're going to keep and try to surround with talent, which they didn't do. And it turns out none of that's a factor right now. But you brought up a really interesting point with the lost season. Obviously, the Indians' perhaps largest asset as far as trade goes loses a tremendous amount of value.
Yeah, no, I know it always sucks. I always feel bad talking about them as like human beings, as assets that are just like tradable goods, but it's just the reality of discussing baseball right now. Like, if you don't want it analyzed that way, you can just like turn it off right now. But I think it is the sort of like fascinating situation where the Indians are sort of like really punished by this. I'm surprised small market teams are okay with it. On the other hand, there's a notion to which like we only have 1 year after this season before a collective bargaining agreement gets negotiated, and that could create all sorts of concerns. But yeah, with Lindor, you basically like they could have traded him with 2 years of control left, which would have pretty massive surplus value. And so you can get a really big centerpiece. And now we're looking at maybe like 85% of the Mookie Betts deal. If the Indians don't play a game this season, because his service time will be structured on his 2019 service time, which means he'll be 1 year closer to free agency. So essentially, you're just like, oh, maybe we get like one Alex Verdugo type. Like, oh, great.
Yeah, well, yeah, the fine line of fitting that deal would be, God, there's no end to the discussion that would create, especially considering how this would, I mean, when thinking about your piece, Mike, I think the hardest part for me with all this, including Lindor, is not really understanding how the market changes. We don't know what baseball is going to look like whenever it comes back. If Major League Baseball decides to come back sometime in the summer without fans coming to the games, if the season opens up next year, what does that look like? How does the lack of money impact next year? I mean, there's so much unknown. You talked about the rest of the team, and I think the one thing the Indians have been pretty good at, it's been extensions, particularly with their rotation. And you mentioned several players who would be ripe for extensions, including guys like Mercado and Reyes and Plesac, along with probably the biggest asset to maybe try to structure to one of those longer term deals, maybe tack on a couple of option years on the end of a free agent run, which of course without the new contract we don't know, but Shane Bieber probably at the top of that list. With so much unknown, not really knowing the shift in the market, not really knowing what baseball looks like when it comes back. If it doesn't come back to 2021, random discussions about 2021 being canceled, which I love Twitter. But with all of this unknown, Mike, it really does put the 2021 season in jeopardy for the Indians, and that without knowing what Lindor is going to do, or selling him even on a low end deal for a top-ish prospect and top one prospect alone, the Indians may have to sell next year in many respects, right? I mean, there's just a lot of unknown out there.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing to me were the secondary concerns with this organization, where you say, oh, we're going to pay Clevinger roughly the same next year, but he's going to have 2 years of control left. He's not going to have been injured this year. Like, he's going to pitch a healthy season. He's going to be closer to free agency. We just had our leverage disappear with Clevinger. Like, do we trade him too? Because once you trade Lindor, you have to start thinking about, what pieces are really nailed to the floor. I mean, right now, Bieber's probably nailed to the floor, and he's just too good. Although, once again, you're probably losing a season to him. But I think the uncertainty that's even worse for me is just, it all felt like, even though there were a lot of reasons to be critical of the org, and I'm certainly was not like super optimistic of a post Lindor world, but with, the Indians minors being what, most people would believe like the deepest they've been in 8 to 10 years, especially in the lower minors, you're like, oh, there is some reasoning to, we play out 2020 in pursuit of a title with Lindor, we flip him, we have all this talent coming up. It's a really narrow retool. It's not like a rebuild. We're not just, tearing everything down, and just like ripping a year of development time away from these guys is like a huge, huge cost to the Indians, because they have to make decisions in uncertainty on players they now have less control with even less information about how they would rebuild than they need. So I think that part of it is just like we've reached this like tipping point where the Indians now have to make more radical decisions with less information. And you don't make good decisions when that's what you have. It's much harder to make good decisions, I should say.
Well, you made a great point in your piece, and probably the most distressing part of that piece was the low end of the minors, and you discussed kind of the point of all of these young players, of which the Indians have a lot of really quality young players. You and I, having dealt with the minor league system pretty extensively over the past 7 or 8 years, this is the year where we start to see that high end talent, as you noted, kind of shake itself out. not playing at all this year really puts not only a damper in just knowing how that shakes out, but the outline concern for me is you never know, especially with the new collective bargaining agreement coming up, especially with the talk of really reshaping the minor league system across the board. Like, I mean, I worry about players who aren't playing legit baseball games for over a year, especially when you're 19, 20, 21, you're getting your feet wet. It can make talented players, and I don't want to say untalented, but the game of baseball is one of those, as you know, Mike, as well as I do, at the lower end of the baseball game where we played. Baseball game is intensely repetitive. Like, it's one of those games where you repeat, you repeat, you repeat. What could the possibility of really, for some of these guys, 18 months away from competitive baseball, it could really reshape the Indians organization top to bottom, and not necessarily in a positive way, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point that I probably didn't underscore enough. And it is fascinating to think about, like if you're an organization right now, what are you doing to make sure, like for the Indians, there shouldn't be a competitive advantage in making sure people like meet their basic needs. But with a lot of these guys in the lower minors who are like, I mean, some of them have big bonuses, but some of those bonuses have been sucked away by agencies, by family, so you have all these like 18 to 20-year-old kids, 18 to 21-year-old kids who do not have they're paid terribly, but at least when you have them, at the facility, you're making sure they have food, some teams provide a place to live now. I mean, this is just one of those situations where like it will be interesting to see what measures teams put in place to make sure that like these people they've invested significant amounts of money in are like getting their basic needs. And by significant amounts, I mean the capped amount that they don't really give them much, but it's more the opportunity cost, like, spending a large portion of a July pool amount on a player. Anyway.
Well, the irony of, I forget where I read it, like players getting, I believe there was a length of time where these minor leaguers were getting 400 a month, or excuse me, although that's maybe a Freudian slip, 400 a week. The irony being that that's mostly more than what most minor leagues get during a regular season. I don't know, the unknown of like worrying about like whether these guys come back as competitive ball players when most of these guys who are coming from the Caribbean or coming from less means are now stuck with less means. It's just kind of a frustrating thing. But, looking at the baseball side of things, Mike, especially with regarding to the Indians, obviously, when you just get into the kind of, I don't know if fun's the right word, but when you're trying to figure out as a podcaster or as a writer, like what to write about, it's hard not to look at the 2021 season. And, there's obviously, you have a player like Clevinger closer to the end of and you mentioned him getting dealt, which you noted in your piece, but you look at, obviously Carlos Santana's contract's up at the end of this year. There's a big move different where you're obviously losing some money on the front end and, probably filling in with a guy, who's not making a lot of money in the minors. But the 2021 Indians, with or without Lindor, are likely to look a lot like a team of, non like veteran players. We're moving away from that 2016 World Series team in a fairly dramatic way. I mean, we still have obviously, guys like Jose Ramirez and tied up for a while, but our rotation, when you look at the 2016 rotation, our rotation is basically reshuffled. You look at our outfield, it's already basically reshuffled. You lose a guy like Carlos Santana, likely. I mean, who knows what he re-signs for? And then you start wondering about those free agents, Mike. Like, what do you think? I mean, you've got to imagine that in 2021, a guy like Carlos Santana likely isn't making the type of money he would make with a season like last year as his season this year.
Yeah, I mean, Santana's, if if they don't play this year, Santana would be entering his age 35 season.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is he going to get more than like the Nelson Cruz 1 in 10 or 100?
especially without playing the season prior, even though it's not his fault.
Yeah. I mean, probably not. One of the things about this that's like become the most devastating for me to contemplate is from a baseball perspective, not a human perspective, everybody. Okay. There are far worse things in this world. I'm like really disappointed to see, definitely always want to see Lindor in Cleveland. Everybody can say that, blah, blah, blah. But like to me, losing the ability to see peak Ramirez and peak Lindor for a season, especially as it relates to their careers, where like people think I'm messing around and probably a Jose Ramirez hype train, but like he and Lindor are literally both on Hall of Fame tracks right now. Like those are Hall of Fame careers so far. Now they can go off, like Jose can put on 30 pounds like Carlos Baerga and suddenly become not good at baseball. He's already pretty pudgy. I can say that I'm a pudgy guy as well. There's how Jose can steal like 20 to 30 bases a season is beyond me. Like that guy does not look, but it's because he's like a savant, a baseball savant. But I guess the point is that, and obviously, everybody would have that context from this era that, everyone missed a season, but to me, it would just be so saddening to see like us lose a 5-WAR Jose Ramirez season that like would be really helpful for a Hall of Fame case if he has a solid rest of his career. And that super sucks.
Well, I mean, it just the lengths of never expecting something like this to happen that puts this kind of damper in the middle of a season. And if you look in the past of players who have missed seasons for a variety of reasons, whether it be rehab or whether it be injury or whether it be time after time again, you see players altered careers from this. I mean, it's going to be fascinating if we miss 2020. And I mean, fascinating again, taking the human element out of this, just to see where everybody lands heading into the 2021 season. You mentioned Clevinger, Mike. You mentioned Santana being gone. You mentioned the likelihood of dealing Lindor. What about, I mean, obviously, I think probably at the top of the list of guys that the Indians would consider moving, maybe even before Clevinger and Lindor, just because of probably ease of deal, would be a guy like Brad Hand. I mean, I think if they don't play in 2020, I mean, I think dealing Brad Hand would almost be a necessity.
Yeah, and what stinks is, once again, it's like, I think the Indians had situated themselves really well with Karinchak and Clace, and they have one or two other guys in the upper minors who I think Sam Hentges could end up being a really impressive bullpen piece. Not sure, but the stuff is there. Doesn't have the command yet. It's a real question. We can discuss him in detail some other time. But I think one of the really important parts about this season for the Indians was, are Karinchak and Clace for real? And if they are for real, having that information makes it super easy for you to like while contending flip Brad Hand at the deadline and like repurpose an asset. Or like move him this following offseason with certainty that like your bullpen should have like it has some like top end talent. But now you sort of have this thing where like we just don't have enough additional information. Like it just makes that decision even more gray, even more difficult. And I agree with you that I think it's probably likely to happen. And look, these are all hypotheticals based on like them not playing. Baseball may be played. I could be wrong. And I'm not saying it won't be played. I'm just saying, like whether it's played or played for a very small amount, there's a really big influence on the next 5 years of baseball in Cleveland. Like, and you almost have to wonder, like, what happens if they start playing, like, in a 100-game season, and you're 15 games in, and you're like 6-9. Is that when you trade Lindor? Like,
well, I mean, there's the unknown, and I didn't check out. I mean, obviously, you can't really talk like. If you play a 100-game season, and we're kind of let's hypothetical, let's throw like a dart at the board, Mike, and let's say that we come in at the break, and let's say we're coming in, middle of July, you're playing a bunch of doubleheaders, and if you're lucky, you get to a 100-game season. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, do they even play around with the trade deadline? Is it one of those things where the league just opens the deadline up until like a midpoint in September, to allow teams like the Indians specifically the opportunity to at least see what they got, and I hate saying it like that because obviously the Indians likely will be very good this year if there is a season. But I mean, we've yet to maybe touch upon the rules. I mean, in a way, I mean, I don't know how the deadline works. I don't know how trading works. It would be terrible for teams to be forced in a July, a 2-week July season to have to make your decision. I mean, if you're 2-13, that's one thing, but can you imagine a 6-9 team going, yeah, we better pull the trigger on the Lindor deal.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just like so fascinating to me. Like, what would be a touch point? Would it be 30 games? Would it be like 40? Like, how soon do you think about pulling the trigger on that if you're like not in first in your division?
I would when you say, so let's give a hypothetical. Let's say July 15th. Yeah, let's just go with July 15th. I don't know what date the All-Star game was supposedly being played, although that's probably not going to be played this year. But let's give a hypothetical of July 15. And let's say with 31 days in August and 16 days in July, let's say that you play 60 games by August 31st. Wouldn't you figure 50 or 60 games, you're at or just past the halfway point of the season? So maybe August 31st?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
that's when I'd slap that deadline probably.
Yeah. Well, and then here comes another interesting question. What does baseball do playoff wise? Do you have a regular playoff season, or do you tweak it a bit so that maybe it looks a little more like it did in the past, where you have a 4-team playoff? Oh, could you imagine the shitstorm that would cause? I got to see 21:45. Okay. Could you imagine the problems that would cause, Mike, if you even alter a 100-game season? Like, I don't even know. You're going to have a situation where you could still have, out of 32 teams, you could still have 25 teams still kind of in the mix.
Yeah. No, and this is it's such a mess. I mean, it's like, in some sense, the hypotheticals are kind of fun to think about. And it is like fascinating to see if you have to make a decision on trading Lindor in like mid-September. Like, what if we put the trade deadline at the 70% mark or something? And the playoff structure is really interesting to me. Like, I actually super would think that like just like a 2 best records in both leagues. Like, I think that makes sense. Like, to me, well, I'd be like, okay.
I don't you think though, Mike, like, this is an opportunity for the league. We talked about this in the Missing podcast, but this really, if they play any games in 2020, and you have to imagine that this would be the opportunity to play around with some unique situations. Like, maybe you make it look a little more like it was in the past. Maybe you have like the doubleheader like set that a lot of people were talking about. But wouldn't this be like the one opportunity for Major League Baseball to say, let's just have it like it used to be? You win the pennant, you're in the World Series. Just to this is the one time a commissioner can say, this is what we're doing. The problem, though, I think we both know, is that it's a money grab. So the likelihood of it being a 2 or a 4-game playoff set, unless you extend to, I don't know, maybe you just play in Florida, I don't know. But, wouldn't this be the opportunity to try something new, as opposed to like kind of falling back into the old school mentality or even the money mentality?
Yeah, I mean, if Major League Baseball wasn't Major League Baseball, I'd say it would make sense. But they're about as progressive as I don't know. There's not even an analogy. They're so regressive.
Maybe, Mike, one thing that hasn't been discussed much over, and maybe it has been, I just haven't been paying attention. When do small market owners like the Indians, when do like owner viability, when does that become an issue with a baseball team not playing baseball? Obviously, the money coming in a variety of ways isn't going to look like it would if you have a season. Obviously, Major League Baseball is making sure all the players are getting paid, which has to fall on the owners. When do baseball owners of specific teams start to have problems being baseball owners?
I don't think any big league teams it becomes problematic. Although it's one of those things that's like, I guess it could if an ownership group is over leveraged or if they don't have like enough liquidity. I don't really imagine many owners being in that situation. Maybe, maybe.
Well,
I think minor league teams are going to shutter like crazy.
yeah, that's the unfortunate. In Raleigh, we have pretty well funded baseball teams with Mudcats, really rich owners, with Durham Bulls, really rich owners. But you look at a lot of teams and a lot of organizations, especially on the low end. You're looking at a high A or a low A or a short season A team that are owned by people like 6 or 7 people who don't make a much don't aren't really millionaires. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out, which is, I think, unfortunately what Major League Baseball really wants. So that the decision that looked like it was going to be attacked on every side by Congress, by fans, by it looks like that kind of is getting taken off their plate a little bit. So that's very, very unfortunate. Um,
Can we talk for like a second about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the dearth of Indians news, I think that watching minor league baseball, which really was, if you go back to the history of the game, that the grassroots levels of baseball have been the heart and soul of baseball from the beginning. It could go away.
So this is one of my things, much like dynamic pricing, where I think that we adopt ideas as being like smarter, innovative when they have like short-term profit generation upside, but we're not looking at like the larger like impacts on fan bases. And to me, this is just like exactly one of those things where it's like, look, like you can own an asset that is not a net revenue positive asset, and it's still valuable for your organization to have in the long term because you don't need it as a profit center. You have massive profit centers, and it's helpful for keeping those profit centers going. And to me, that's what minor league baseball is. Where it's just one of those things where it's like this is like the gate. Minor league baseball is the gateway drug. Like most people can't just afford to like or aren't close enough to like a big league park to just go, and like going for $9 and like having a soda and 5 beers and couple of hot dogs on Dollar Dog Night at your local park, like that's super fun. And I like my fandom is almost like 95%. Like I went to 2 major league games before I was like 20 years old. Like my fandom was all minor league baseball, and I watched baseball religiously, but like a lot of it was like I lived in Ithaca, New York. I went to Binghamton. I was like a clubhouse kid and bat boy. Like I loved minor league baseball, and to me it's just like one of those things where it's like that is just a gateway to like making baseball fun for people. And
The story. I mean, we could probably come up with 5 or 6. I know we've talked a lot about going to minor league games, both as kids and adults. I grew up. I grew up with the Erie Cardinals when the Cardinals were winning World Series. You get the great stories of the Cardinals shifting over to an Orioles organization where Pete Rose's kid plays in town for a while, and while he was a terrible baseball player, it was Pete Rose's kid. I mean, the passion of many young fans come from minor league baseball. And I think if there's one thing both you and I can always agree on, and then I think other than the fact that we can agree that we argue about a lot of things, I think one thing that we will always agree on, Mike, is the simple fact that Major League Baseball misses the boat on catching young fans over and over again and decimating the minor leagues. For two guys who grew up watching minor league baseball, decimating the minor leagues seems to be another one of those nails in the coffin of building new fans.
yeah, to me, it's the biggest. It's just so fundamentally absurd to me, and it is really interesting. I love it. Like minor league baseball is so interesting because it's like I remember, it's just one of those things where you're like, it's a place where you go, you meet a scout. Like everybody's met a scout at a minor league baseball game, or those 5 pitchers are charting, and it's hilarious because they're wearing their like polos, and you see them and they're just skulking. Like I remember I was at a B-Mets game that I wasn't working, just like hanging out behind I think it was because the then Arrows were in the town, the now Rubber Ducks, and I was like sitting right behind. I was like sit behind the plate, which you can do for $9 at a minor league game, and like sitting next to me was like Mike Pelfrey. There's just they're like charting, signing. People would come over, recognize him, he'd sign. He's a very awkward looking man, very tall. But it's just like it's so fun. You're so close to the game in ways that you never are again. As a kid, like it's just like there's so much ability to be so close to the game, and it's anyway.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is
I mean,
all.
that's that. I mean, it's important to bring up. I mean, it's obviously as the season progresses as a non-season. I think this is something that probably most baseball fans won't talk about because it's not on the radar because most people on Twitter are talking about minor league baseball, even though the grassroots of baseball is going to see minor league games. You talk about a town like Raleigh that I'm in now, quarantined many, many miles from home. You're looking at a town rooted in the fundamentals of minor league baseball. I mean, obviously Durham Bulls aren't going anywhere, and obviously the Carolina Mudcats aren't going anywhere. But that doesn't mean that like a team like Kinston, who is rooted in the history of not only Major League Baseball, but Negro Leagues Baseball. You look at a team like Erie, Pennsylvania, that is lucky enough to be 90 miles away from Pittsburgh, 90 miles away from Cleveland, and 90 miles away from a AAA team in Buffalo, but has always had that grassroots, like local team. And from single A to the Erie Cardinals in the short season New York Penn League to Pioneer League to, now, dealing with the double A and the Detroit Tigers. And the housed many of the Tiger players who ultimately ended up winning World Series from Verlander on. You're taking away, and what's fun about a city like Erie, for example, is you've got this weird mix of Indians fans, Pirate fans, and Tiger fans strictly because of the minor league team. I mean, you go down to Kinston, North Carolina today, and 50% of the baseball hats that you see in Kinston, North Carolina, are Cleveland Indians hats because the Indians had been in town for 30 years. So I think that part of baseball, that creation of a fan, and not necessarily a hometown fan, but a home team fan, disappears. And it's important to talk about. And Mike, we met writing for minor league baseball. It's not like we're talking about just 60 years ago. This is something that, how many friendships do both of us owe, because of minor league baseball? I mean, the whole reason Everyone Hates Cleveland exists is because of minor league baseball.
Yes. Look what it has given to the world. This amazing platform for me to write once every 4 months. But no, I agree. Like so much of like baseball is relational, and like so much of my fondest memories of my childhood are like, and like even adulthood are like my dad and I have met in Buffalo now that I live like 4 hours away from him to catch a minor league game together. I do a 2.5 hour drive. He does an hour and a half drive. Like it's just like it's one of those things you do because it's fun to share. It's just
all I'm saying, Mike, is as a son, your dad should drive more. Erie's the perfect spot.
It's true. It's true.
All right. Go ahead.
I've never spent any time in Erie. I'm going to be honest with you, Jim. I
Erie,
drive good all the time.
Yeah. Well, listen, first of all, let's take a pause here for a second. Erie, Pennsylvania is I'm going to say this, and everybody from Erie's going to laugh. Everybody from Cleveland's going to laugh. I'm going to laugh a little. But to me, Erie is this like sleeping giant held back by, I've got to be careful. I'll just say held back by old school mentality. You have a city on the lake with a lot of potential. I hate that word, but Erie's a great place. We have a great craft beer scene now, and which is the small part of how Erie's starting to grow. But it'll really be interesting to see how this next 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months play into Erie's development over the years. But let's move away from Erie and let's bounce back into the Indians a bit, Mike. I want to talk to you specifically about a few specific Indians players, and again, I'm going to try to be a little bit vague here, simply because we don't know. Obviously, there's a human quality to all of what we're saying, but just looking at the baseball side of things, let's talk about a few Indians players and how this lack of playing baseball could impact them, positive or negative. And I want to start with a player that I think both, Gage and I know you're in on this guy too, but how does this time affect a guy like Franmil Reyes, who by all indicators had walked into this spring training in the best shape of his life, clearly had worked on his performance in the outfield. Does this time off hurt a guy like Franmil Reyes, or does the extra time give him more time to kind of in isolation continue progress, getting more fit and getting more better as a position player? Because I think the one area you probably could work at in isolation is defense. I mean, I know we can get into the conversation about how important defense is in the outfield, but I think we both can agree that he's got to at least be able to move around a bit. Is a guy like Franmil Reyes, minus perhaps, what we might have seen with him kind of honing in the swing, might this be a boon for Franmil Reyes, just giving him more time to get into better shape? Or again, are we in that unknown of we're in quarantine and, the quarantine 15? I don't know. What do you think? Franmil Reyes, is this a plus or a minus?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I'd say I probably would rather see him. I'm probably more optimistic about someone like remaining healthy when they're playing and not living in a world without certainty about when they're going to play baseball next.
Does this give a player like, you mentioned Daniel Johnson in your piece, does this give DJ an opportunity when he comes back to get the look that many thought he wouldn't get based on, a lot of people in front of him? Let's say we're coming back in 2021. I mean, obviously this puts Daniel Johnson right kind of at the forefront of, do we really want him playing more minor league games now at this point when we thought he would be a big league player? And I mentioned Daniel Johnson, but I want to throw in Nolan Jones into this equation as well, because, I mean, in this happy, like, gray area of what the heck's going to happen, does Nolan Jones maybe walk into a 2021 season after not playing in 2020 as a Major League Baseball player?
Yeah, I think that's very possible. I think that's an interesting question. And I do wonder, like, I think there's so many possible iterations of what happens. Like, I think there's a strong possibility that Major League Baseball doesn't play a game, but like they play the Arizona Fall League in October and November, and Nolan Jones plays 25 games there. Like, I think that sort of thing is possible.
Could you see, just kind of jumping in here, Mike, could you see the Indians and Major League Baseball, in October and November, building a relationship with a lot of those fun winter leagues to get a lot of Major League players some game time action?
Yeah, and I think it's just so key for a handful of those guys. Like, to me, and it is really, I will say we live in such a different era with pitchers and how like pitcher development is viewed. I think largely because of the driveline establishment now. They're part of establishment baseball. But it seems like so much of pitcher development is now like you're in the lab. Like, beyond the strength and conditioning you have to do, like so much of it is like, oh, he's in the lab. And so like in a lot of ways you're like, maybe this is good for Zach Plesac. Maybe he spends like this is more of an off season for him to work on the shape of his slider, like improve command of his changeup, like maybe impact the axis spin on his fastball. Like, so to me, it's really interesting because I think it really puts pitchers, I think it's probably really positive for pitchers. You're not getting a lot of innings. You're not like leveraging your body in the same way, but you get to make a lot of adjustments. Hitting to me is like, I still think that like analytics and everything's advanced, but hitting, pitching has become much more of a science for a lot of these guys.
Well, could we, I mean, as you're sitting here talking about this and you start thinking about how specialized baseball has gotten, especially when discussing rotations and bullpens, you go back to those, the lower mound era where, pitchers gained advantage. Could you be looking at, no matter when, baseball comes back into play? And when you talk about a season for the Indians, if we deal with hypotheticals again, and you talk about a season that starts in July 15th with pitchers who can still pitch, versus hitters who are maybe at a bit of a disadvantage, a competitive advantage. Could you see a scenario where a team like the Indians walk into a, say, 2020 season, or even better yet, a 2021 season, where you gain an 18-month advantage on hitters? Could you see the Indians gaining advantage because of their rotation? You mentioned Plesac, but obviously you've got a few young guys there who are still trying to hone their craft, Savali being one of them, even a guy like Jeffrey Rodriguez. Could you see the Indians walk into a 2020 season in the middle of July with an advantage based specifically on the fact that the league might just be for a month a hitter's league or a pitcher's league?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. And I mean, it's just one of those, like, it is super fascinating to me for the Indians because in some ways you're like, Clace will be healthy before baseball starts again. Oh, Clevinger will be healthy. Carrasco, he gets a little more time to strengthen his body. Like, is that really the worst thing for him right now? Probably not. So there are a lot of like real benefits, and I do think it's just so fascinating to me with like when you have guys like Plesac who are sort of going down that Clevinger Bauer path, where like, and Bieber's done this to some extent. I don't know about Savali. I think Savali just randomly adding like 2 to 3 miles per hour on his fastball when he got to the big league level was probably not just happenstance. I'm sure he had some fun conversations with Trev and Clev, but it is like super interesting to me because like we know so much about how like they can just go into the lab and like work on Plesac and be like, hey, we want to build these pitches, and we don't have as much of a feel for that yet with hitters. Like we have hit tracks. So like I remember talking to Eric Haas, and this is why I was always fascinated by Eric Haas. And I was like, oh, you totally changed your home run output, blah blah blah. Why is just using hit tracks all year, trying to optimize my launch angle and my contact point, mostly my contact point. And we don't always know when hitters are doing that. So it is really fascinating. Where to me, any significant time off seems like it always has advantages to pitchers, just because I feel like it's easier for them to like strengthen and protect their bodies is important for pitchers, and B, like I'm much more optimistic that a pitcher can like reconstruct himself or like improve himself than I am like in the art of hitting realm. I don't know.
What's going to be insane though is if we do have a season in 2020, Mike, is the stories that you get in April of these crazy random players that take off. Imagine enhancing, let's say that, take a guy like Franmil Reyes who started off last season, with San Diego, like tearing the league apart. Imagine a scenario where you're playing, 2 or 3 doubleheaders a game and you get a month of Franmil Reyes raking. Like you could see some really interesting statistics kind of as the season progresses, just based on the length of the season. Do you think, Mike, as you were kind of talking, it was kind of occurring to me, and thinking about the Indian system specifically, and kind of how isolated players are sometimes left to be in the Indian system, kind of developing their own maybe sweet spot with hitting, or developing their own, style of becoming better pitchers. The Indians have sort of, under the, I don't know, guise of the current, front office, more specifically, maybe Terry Francona. Like, could you see us, I again, trying to look at the Indians and how they come out of all this, if they do come out and play in 2020, with the Indians having a lot of players who are sort of isolationists and in the respect of improving their game. You mentioned Eric Haas. A lot of players in the Indians minor league system have kind of taken upon themselves to enhance their swing in specific ways. Because of that, it's occurred to me that perhaps this is a benefit in some ways to players like Plesac, Savali, Clevinger, Bauer, who's not with the Indians anymore, who kind of led this line of thinking with the Indians. This really does kind of align with how the Indians have been prepping, specifically these players we see a jump with Bieber, these kind of isolation that, where you can talk to a guy like Bauer, or you could talk to these guys at Driveline, where a lot of other teams are sort of under a singular umbrella. Do you think this is a benefit for the Indians, I think, going forward?
Man, that's a good question. I really wish I had articulated a good answer to it in the time that you were asking it. I certainly had a bit, but I still don't have a good answer to it. I do think the Indians' approach to development is really fascinating in that sense. I think they do often they have some levels of core principles, but like the level of autonomy and support they provide is like teams players who come over from other organizations always revel in the fact that the Indians have a really detailed plan of what they think work, and then they talk about it with the player, and the player will tweak it if they think these things fit and these don't, and it's really like a highly collaborative developmental process rather than sort of like a top-down developmental process. Let me pose a fun question to you. Terry Francona is not a young man.
Oh God, we're gonna go here.
No, I
Okay.
mean like it is fascinating to me
No.
because I think the last few years he's been sort of like it has been a drag on him. Like it's been
Yes.
pretty
No.
noticeable.
Wait. Wait.
And
Now
so
I want to dive into what you think I thought because this is what I
no.
thought.
Like one of
This
the
is
things that's interesting to me is like after this year off, I mean like I felt like he was already like I know he had signed extensions and extensions, but it felt like retirement wasn't actually particularly far away for Terry Francona. Now he's probably going to lose. He could potentially lose a season. Like,
I the flip side of that though, Mike, is as you say that, you ponder, this would be an interesting opportunity for Frank Kona to say, I'm going to call it a career. However, the flip side of this is as a manager not having to manage, it's a good way to get healthy again. It's a good way to kind of get the bite back again. It's a good way to get fit again, dependent on what he's doing by himself, which would be a podcast in and of itself. I think the flip side of this, Mike, is one, a guy like Terry Francona, call it ego, call it just being a baseball guy. I can't see him walking out without that one last season. It might make him closer to the end. I mean, I think that, I'm assuming that manager contracts work the same way as player contracts in the confines of at least how ownership is. I mean, I'm sure they're paying Terry Francona. So, does he, I don't remember how long the contract was, but does this put him closer to retirement as a field manager? Probably. Do I think that he's going to walk out without having that last season? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Zero chance. I mean, I don't know if you've noticed this, Mike, but the guy has a fairly large ego.
thankfully, we were a top 5 in bunting last year as an American League team. So that was
We almost made it through this whole podcast without talking about that, but such is life. All right, I have a few questions for you, Mike, on the road out of this podcast. I'm going to make them yes and no questions. You can actually add more to this or not, but I'm going to lead it with a non-yes or no question. Through this whole like random quarantine, the one guy that I have not been able to get off my mind is Yasiel Puig, who literally is just out there. Okay, without really kind of fine tuning it, I think the Indians roster is set. I don't think Yasiel Puig, under any circumstances, is coming back to the Indians. But do you think that with the likelihood that this season is either going to get called or we're going to have a shortened season, let's say we have a shortened season, could you see the potential of Puig just being okay, signing a 1-year, finish the year out contract, small money, maybe back with the Indians, but maybe not, just with anybody? I mean, does Puig, if there's a season in 2020, Puig is signing probably a really super team friendly deal, right?
yeah. No, I think it's really possible he'll sign like if baseball's played, he'll sign like a 1-year, $2 million or $4 million deal. Like I think that's definitely in play. I think I would doubt it would be with the Indians because they basically just badmouthed him at almost every turn. It's a lot of like, there's a lot of leaks about like his personality not meshing. I think they've been calling him a different egg. I think is that how they've been couching this? So if I were him, I probably wouldn't come back here, even if the Indians were offering that. But who knows? He may love like Carlos Santana, and a couple of those guys seem super like guys people really enjoy playing with, in general. So I mean, I don't know.
All
I
right,
think
let me throw out some yes or no's for you as we wrap things up. I'll keep it to 5 or less. I'm going to throw out again. I'm going to start with the low hanging fruit. Will there be professional baseball at the major league level played in 2020?
no.
Will there be a minor league system of games played in Arizona or Florida in October or November?
I think that my answer would be yes, I guess.
I think when you talk about creativity, that is the low hanging fruit, right? Like you could conceivably have a spring training for your minor leagues in October and November and kind of dial those guys in a bit, right?
Yeah, that's what I would do,
All
honestly.
right. Well, that means it's not happening because whatever we say is pretty much the opposite of what actually happens. So, um, it, do you think that the kind of spinning this back around is the fear of Corona and COVID? And I know I said I was going to mention it, but you kind of have to at this point. I mean, at what point does Major League Baseball just come out and say, this is the end of the season? And I know I said yes or no questions, but I'm going to throw this little tidbit out there. A couple of days ago, President Trump had a meeting with all the commissioners of the professional sports. And, our minds can kind of decide what was said during that meeting. You would have to imagine it involved the economy a bit. Do you think that based on perhaps that conversation or perhaps, I mean, do you think that baseball, the professional sports as a whole, but baseball specifically, since it's a summer sport, do you think they're going to hold out to the last second to play baseball games? Because there is probably some data that would suggest playing baseball in some form or fashion does help the economy a bit.
Yeah, I just can't see, like, I can't see us being in August without a game of baseball being played, and Major League Baseball being like, we got a contingency plan for this. Can still happen. Like, I think we're gonna know if baseball is gonna be played by like July 15th. And look,
Okay.
maybe it's played in a month.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm crazy.
Well, I mean, Gage is certainly, of the three of us, the proponent of the four of us, counting Frank, the proponent of making sure that the baseball happens. I mean, how interested are you, Mike, in a season without fans? I mean, I think that, obvious jokes aside, I think in Cleveland, and if you do it that way, do you do it in the towns, or do you do it in some other central location?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have a problem with them dropping all 30 teams in Arizona and just playing baseball, and while the rest of us are still in place, sheltering
Gosh,
in place.
that's so fast. It's so fascinating because if you're doing that, then in theory, when you're playing at a complex, you're playing major league games at your main complex. In theory, you're doing minor leagues the same way, right? Like, I mean, obviously you might not have 6 different levels, but you might, like, I mean, gosh, how fascinating is it, Mike, if you have like a low tier, mid tier, upper tier where double A and triple A are playing together, your uh your high A and low A are playing together, and then your rookie league and your short season are playing together. Like, this is fascinating stuff. And how does this, oh my gosh, like, I'm sorry.
So like already fascinating to me is like short season's gone, right? Because we have a draft that's going to have 5 players now. Usually short season teams are like 80% your like draft picks from the 4th round to the 30th round. Like that's usually what it is. Sometimes you get sometimes you get a first round pick in there if your team went with a prep player instead of a college player. But if you have a college player, anyway. But yeah, like short season, like is that just over now? Like
all of this is so fascinating. Unfortunately, I mean, the teetering point right now is whether they play or whether they don't. And we don't have the answers to that. I do know I enjoy kind of the travailing like pathway of talking baseball with you. I'll ask you one more yes or no question. And this is a really hypothetical question, and this is kind of a silly question to ask based on everything. If there is a 2020 season, without knowing how many teams make the playoffs, without knowing any amount of games, percentage in your head, Mike, of the potential for the Indians to be a playoff team without knowing anything. What do you think? Like, let's go with our July 15th timeline, and let's say the Indians come back July 15th, and what percentage chance do you think our Indians hold in that scenario of making a 4, 6, 8, 12 team playoff?
I'd say probably like 35 to 40%.
You know what? I would absolutely take 30. Would you say 35 to 40% of making the playoffs in a full season?
I'd probably say in a full season it'd be more like 45%.
Not bad.
So like one of the tough things is like when you compress the sample, worse teams, there's like a greater chance that like they just have a good 100-game stretch.
The random,
essentially. So like, or like just like mediocre teams like the White Sox, like their pitching sucks, but what if you get like 10 randomly good starts from blank 5-starter? Like that happens. We've seen it. Who's that Cardinal we traded for? That had like, man, my memory's terrible. Never mind. Not gonna. Aaron Laffey. Aaron Laffey had a stretch. Just like, and like the goal of 162 games is that eventually Aaron Laffey's Aaron Laffey. And like, there aren't a lot of one-hit wonders in baseball where like a guy's really good one year.
Jeremy Sowers.
Yeah, like.
Who is the guy we had? 2005, 2006 was our 5th starter.
Billy Traber. Oh no. Ellerton, Scott Ellerton.
No. Gosh. I mean, I've got Stanford in my head, but it's not him.
I thought you were going Billy Traber at first, and I was like real fired up.
No, I can't remember. I just this is where I'm so dying to have the season, because we're about to enter, as a baseball fan, Aprils are so fun because you have these unknown dudes. Oh, there's always one or two unknown dudes that have these unbelievable starts to the season, and they're hitting like 680 in like the 3rd week of April, and then by the 3rd week of May they're playing single A baseball again and sitting at a bar most of the time because they're never making it to the majors. But this could be one of those shotgun seasons, dependent on roster size, and dependent on when they start, dependent on double headers, and but going forward, I think the thing that interests me the most is how, regardless of what happens in 2020, going into 2021, how this could change the foundations of baseball going forward. And segueing back into Mike's piece, and I'm sorry, Mike, I'm going to take this from you. I'm going to actually let you talk about it in a second. We're going to wrap up shop here, and we actually talked an hour about the Indians and some other stuff. That's actually impressive. Watch it not record. But I do want to segue back to Mike's piece. Mike does talk about the unknown. Make sure you go to everyonehatescleveland.com. Check out Mike's latest piece on the Cleveland Indians missing out on 2020 and how that could affect their future. It does ring a bit hollow of a future, because and I it's not a negative piece, but it obviously spins a small market kind of conundrum. Mike, talk a little bit about your piece before we head on out.
Yeah, I think the biggest key to it is uncertainty for organizations with limited resource allocation is really dangerous. It has you making decisions when you're not ready to make decisions, and it has you making decisions when you don't have enough information to make sound decisions. And 2020 disappearing has the ability to sort of create a situation where the Indians are having to make a series of decisions with a lot less information than they would want.
All right, that's a great place to wrap it up. Check out everyonehatescleveland.com. I guess I have to write something now. I have no idea what to write about, but we'll figure out something. And I actually have some ideas for future podcasts. There's no reason why we can't talk about specific players going forward. So check out everyonehatescleveland.com. Check out everyonehatescleveland.com, the podcast. Mike, awesome. Talk to you soon. All right, we're out. Go Tribe.